When Naomi Carter disappeared into Blackwater Bay's white fog, the whole town blamed the quiet black girl before the search even began. Her mother collapsed at the harbor clinic, clutching Naomi's broken glasses like courtroom evidence, while the 3 girls who betrayed her stood outside pretending to cry. But the moment an injured boy arrives with a 30-year-old lighthouse map, the lie begins to collapse, and what follows feels less like a rescue and more like a trial where guilt changes sides. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. The morning fog rolled into Blackwater Bay, Maine, the way it always did in late October. Slow, white, and secretive, curling over the harbor water and wrapping itself around fishing boats, dock posts, and the weathered storefronts facing the sea. The town was small, the kind of coastal place where everyone knew which porch light belonged to which family and which boat engine coughed before sunrise. Salt lived in the air here, mixed with pine, wet wood, and the distant cry of gulls circling above the gray Atlantic. By 7 in the morning, the harbor was already awake, and so was Naomi Carter. Naomi was 22, a young black woman with warm, deep brown skin that glowed softly even beneath the cold coastal light. Her hair was cut short in a neat, close style that framed her small, delicate face, making her expressive dark eyes stand out behind her round, wire-rimmed glasses. She had the kind of face people trusted instinctively, not because it was dramatic, but because it always seemed thoughtful, gentle, and quietly observant. Slim and medium height, Naomi moved with quick grace, her long wool coat swaying around her legs as she crossed Harbor Street with a leather satchel tucked beneath one arm. Inside that satchel was the object she valued most, a worn, brown notebook, edges softened by years of use filled with local legends, sketches of shoreline landmarks, fragments of overheard stories, and half-finished thoughts written in careful blue ink. Naomi had always been drawn to forgotten things. Maybe it started when she was 12 and found an old sailor's compass buried in the sand behind the seafood shack. Maybe it came from growing up listening to old people talk about storms that had names, promises made at sea, and people who disappeared when the fog came too close. Or maybe it came from the fact that Naomi never liked stories with missing pieces. That morning, she stepped into Evelyn's Books and Curios, the oldest bookstore in Blackwater Bay. The bell above the door gave its familiar soft chime. The shop smelled like cedar shelves, old paper, candle wax, and sea dampness that no amount of heat could ever quite erase. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Evelyn Moore, a white woman in her late 70s with silver hair pinned into a loose bun and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She was short, slightly stooped, and wore oversized knitted cardigans no matter the season. Years ago, after losing her husband in a winter boating accident, Evelyn had turned her grief into ritual, opening the bookstore every morning before dawn, making tea at exactly 6:30, and keeping the town's forgotten history alive through books, maps, and preserved letters. "Morning, Naomi," Evelyn said, her voice warm but brisk. "Morning, Mrs. Evelyn." Naomi slipped off her gloves and moved instinctively toward the returns cart. She had worked here for nearly 4 years, ever since Evelyn noticed the teenage girls spending afternoons reading maritime folklore in the history aisle. What began as curiosity turned into purpose. Naomi didn't just shelve books. She listened, collected, remembered. That was why the town loved her. She knew which widower came every Tuesday for war memoirs, which child liked ghost stories, which old woman secretly read romance novels hidden inside gardening books. And today, like most mornings, someone was already waiting. By the reading nook sat Captain Henry Doyle, a retired fisherman of 71 with weather-cut skin, broad shoulders gone slightly stooped with age, and hands permanently rough from decades of rope and salt water. His white beard was uneven. His heavy coat smelled faintly of brine, and one knee still dragged slightly from the storm accident that had ended his years at sea. In his hands was an unopened envelope. Naomi smiled the moment she saw him. "Her letter again?" Henry nodded, eyes lowering. "My eyes aren't what they used to be." Naomi sat across from him and carefully unfolded the fragile paper. It was from his late wife, Margaret, written 23 years earlier before her illness took her. Naomi had read it to him many times before, but never once did she rush it. Her voice softened as she read the familiar words. Henry closed his eyes, listening. Outside, gulls cried above the harbor. Inside, the old fisherman smiled through grief. This was what made Naomi unforgettable in Blackwater Bay. Not beauty alone, not intelligence alone, but the way she treated memory like something sacred. After Henry left, Naomi returned to the back archive room to organize a newly donated box of maps and nautical journals. Dust rose into the shaft of pale window light. She coughed softly and lifted a cracked leather tube from the bottom of the box. Inside was a rolled map, yellowed and brittle with age. Carefully, she opened it across the sorting table. It was an old hand-drawn map of Blackwater Bay from decades earlier. Her eyes narrowed behind her glasses. There, marked in faded ink near the northern coastline, was a circle around North Breakwater Lighthouse. Next to it, someone had written 3 words. "She waits here." Naomi's fingers stilled. A chill moved up her arms. For a moment, the shop felt strangely silent. Then the front bell rang again. By the time Naomi stepped outside during lunch, the fog had thinned just enough for sunlight to silver the water. Across the street sat Carter's Harbor Kitchen, the seafood restaurant run by her parents. Her father, Daniel Carter, was standing outside stacking lobster crates. Daniel was a tall black man in his early 50s, broad-shouldered with strong hands, close-cropped hair flecked with gray, and a calm steadiness that made everyone in town trust him. Years of long mornings on the docks and even longer evenings in the kitchen had carved quiet discipline into his personality. Inside, Ruth Carter, Naomi's mother, moved between tables. Ruth was 48, elegant in a grounded, practical way. Slim, medium height with soft brown skin, warm hazel-brown eyes, and a voice that could calm arguments before they started. Losing a younger child years ago before birth had made her fiercely protective of Naomi, a wound that deepened every warning she gave. "Don't stay late tonight," Ruth said as Naomi came in. "I won't." Daniel glanced toward the northern shoreline, where the fog still clung thicker, especially not near the North Breakwater. Naomi smiled faintly. "Dad, I'm just going back to the bookstore." Still, she noticed the look they exchanged, the same look she'd seen every year when Autumn Festival Week began. By late afternoon, Naomi locked the shop and stepped back onto Harbor Street. That was when she noticed them. Madison Reed, Chloe Bennett, and Sierra Hall were standing near the flour barrels outside the bakery. Madison, tall and polished, had blonde hair always perfectly styled and the kind of beauty that worked hard to look effortless. She came from one of the wealthier families in town and had grown up expecting attention. Naomi's quiet popularity had become something Madison increasingly resented. Chloe was softer in appearance, light brown hair, slim frame, anxious smile, but easily influenced, often following Madison's lead even when discomfort showed in her eyes. Sierra, the tallest of the 3, had darker features, athletic posture, and a sharper tongue than either of the others. Her father's constant criticism had turned her insecurity into sarcasm, especially toward girls she felt overshadowed by. "Naomi," Madison called brightly, too brightly. "Hey." They chatted for a few moments, all surface-level warmth. Festival plans, decorations, harbor booths. But Naomi caught the glance Madison shot Chloe, a quick look. A private look. The kind people think no one notices. Naomi noticed everything. As she continued down Dock Lane, she felt eyes on her. At the far northern edge of the harbor, near the old rocks, stood Mr. Elias Boone. 79, tall but gaunt, wrapped in a dark wool peacoat, Elias had the weathered face of a man who had spent more years watching storms than speaking to people. Once the lighthouse keeper of North Breakwater, he now lived alone in the keeper's cottage, carrying the silence of old grief like another layer of clothing. His eyes rested on Naomi with a heaviness that felt less like curiosity and more like dread. Then he turned and disappeared into the mist, Back inside the bookstore near closing time, Naomi found a folded newspaper left on the front desk. No name, no note, only a delivery stamp. That meant Noah. Noah was the town's 13-year-old paperboy, slight and quick-moving, with curly dark hair beneath a knit cap, sharp gray-brown eyes, and an old soul's habit of appearing where no one expected him. Ever since losing his parents in a highway accident at age 8, he had developed an eerie stillness, as if tragedy had taught him to observe before speaking. Naomi unfolded the paper. The headline was old. Local woman still missing after fog night incident. 30 years later, her breath caught. Below the headline was a grainy black and white photo of a young woman standing near the lighthouse. The resemblance was unsettling, not exact, but close enough to make Naomi stare. The shop suddenly felt colder. That night, Naomi returned home beneath street lamps glowing amber through the mist. The town was quiet. Boats knocked gently against their moorings. Somewhere in the distance, the lighthouse horn sounded once. At dinner, Ruth was quieter than usual. The festival lanterns outside the harbor restaurant swayed in the wind. Finally, as Naomi rose to head upstairs, Ruth touched her wrist. Her mother's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Naomi." Naomi turned. Ruth's eyes were fixed on the dark window beyond the kitchen, where the sea could barely be seen through the fog. "There are places out on the water," she said softly, "that don't take lives right away." A pause. They just wait for people to come back. Naomi stood frozen. Outside, the fog thickened against the glass, and far beyond the harbor, somewhere near the North Breakwater, a light flickered once in the darkness. The next morning arrived beneath a sky the color of brushed steel, the kind of cold Maine autumn morning that carried salt in the wind and promised an early sunset. Blackwater Bay looked deceptively peaceful, with gulls circling low over the docks and fishing lines tapping gently against wooden posts. But Naomi couldn't shake the feeling her mother's warning had left in her chest. There are places out on the water that don't take lives right away. They just wait for people to come back. The words followed her all the way down Harbor Street as she unlocked Evelyn's Books and Curios just after sunrise. Inside, the shop felt warmer than the world outside. The old radiator hissed softly beneath the front window, filling the room with the familiar scent of heated dust, cedar shelves, and worn paper. Naomi hung her coat carefully, adjusted her round glasses, and took out the old lighthouse map she had found the day before. For a moment, she stared again at the faded circle around North Breakwater Lighthouse and the chilling words written beside it. "She waits here." Before she could let the thought settle too deeply, the front bell rang. It was her parents. Daniel Carter stepped in first, tall and broad in his heavy brown dock jacket, carrying the cold harbor air in with him. Behind him came Ruth Carter, elegant even in practical winter layers, her dark curls tucked beneath a knitted scarf, concern still lingering in her warm eyes from the night before. They were leaving for Portland to pick up a seafood shipment and restock the restaurant before the autumn rush. "Stay with Mrs. Evelyn today," Daniel said, his voice steady but firmer than usual. "Help her organize the inventory, close up before dark, and do not go anywhere near Harbor Light tonight." Ruth rested a hand on Naomi's shoulder, her touch gentle but loaded with meaning. Especially not the island after sunset. Naomi nodded, "I promise." For a moment, Ruth seemed about to say more, but instead she'd only kissed Naomi's forehead before following Daniel back into the cold morning. Naomi spent the next few hours sorting rare books, stacking old shipping invoices, and helping Mrs. Evelyn wrap first-edition novels for 2 collectors from Bangor. Around noon, the bell chimed again, and this time the visitors were less expected. Madison Reed entered first, wearing a cream wool coat that looked far too expensive for bookstore dust. Her blonde hair pinned back neatly, lips curved in a smile so polished it almost reflected the shop lights. Behind her came Chloe Bennett, pale and slim in a gray sweater dress, her nervous smile softer but clearly rehearsed. Sierra Hall followed last, taller than the other 2, athletic in build, with dark auburn hair tied into a practical ponytail and a guarded expression she tried hard to soften. "You look busy," Madison said brightly. Naomi glanced between them. A little. We thought we'd help, Chloe added, stepping toward a stack of unsorted books before Naomi could answer. For a brief moment, Naomi simply stared. These were not girls who volunteered to dust shelves. Still, before she could question it, Sierra was already wiping the inside of the front windows with surprising efficiency, while Madison began folding brown paper around outgoing book parcels. Mrs. Evelyn emerged from the back room, visibly startled. Well, she murmured, adjusting her silver glasses. This is unexpected. The next hour moved strangely fast. Chloe sorted invoices by date with quiet focus. Madison tied shipping twine with perfect little bows, and Sierra helped Naomi carry heavier archive boxes upstairs. If Naomi hadn't known them better, she might have believed this was genuine kindness. But several times she caught Madison exchanging glances with Chloe. Not long, not obvious. Just enough. When the last of the work was finished, Madison leaned against the counter with an easy smile. You should come with us tonight. Naomi blinked. To Harbor Light? Madison nodded. It's the Autumn Festival. Music, lanterns, chowder stands, the whole island lit up. Winter's almost here, Naomi. It's not like we get many nights like this. Sierra crossed her arms, trying for casual. You work too much? Chloe smiled faintly. Just one fun night. Naomi hesitated. Her promise to her parents still sat heavily in her mind, but outside she could already hear distant preparations near the harbor. Hammering from festival stalls, laughter from dock workers stringing lights, the kind of energy that only came once a year. Before she could answer, Mrs. Evelyn suddenly pressed a hand to her chest. Her face tightened. Mrs. Evelyn? Naomi moved instantly toward her. It's nothing, the older woman said, though the tightness in her expression said otherwise. Just a sharp pain. Naomi guided her into the chair behind the register, concern replacing every other thought. Mrs. Evelyn had been strong for years, but age and grief had begun taking quiet tolls on her body. I should stay, Naomi said softly. Madison stepped closer, voice smooth. She'll be resting by then. We can leave later. Mrs. Evelyn opened her mouth as if to object. For one strange second, Naomi thought the older woman looked frightened. But then the pain seemed to pass, and she only gave Naomi a tired smile. Go enjoy one evening, dear. That settled it. By late afternoon, Naomi had changed into a dark navy coat, tucked her notebook into her satchel, and joined the three girls as they walked toward the harbor causeway leading to Harbor Light Island. The tide had already begun to pull back, exposing the stone path that connected the mainland to the small island beyond. The sea breathed cold around them. As they approached the first stretch of exposed rock, Naomi noticed something caught near the jagged shoreline below. A small, abandoned rowboat, half buried in seaweed and barnacles. Its wood was pale with age, one side cracked open from years of storms. Painted faintly across its side was a single name, Marin. Naomi slowed. The sight of it sent a strange shiver through her, as if she had seen the name somewhere before, though she couldn't place where. Before she could think further, a gust of wind tore through the causeway, scattering loose pages from her satchel. Wait. Several pages of her notebook fluttered across the stones. A hand reached down before she could. A young man stood beside her, gathering the pages carefully so they wouldn't blow into the surf. He was tall, white, and striking in a quiet, old-money kind of way. Dark brown hair swept back by the wind, sharp gray eyes, and a navy peacoat tailored well enough to hint at a wealthier life than anyone else walking that causeway. Yet his expression was unexpectedly warm. You dropped these. Naomi took the papers a little breathless. Thank you. He gave a small smile. Julian Whitmore. Naomi Carter. Bookstore girl by the harbor, right? He said, as if he had heard of her before. Naomi laughed softly. That obvious? In a town this small, everyone knows everyone. There was something observant about Julian, almost scholarly beneath the polished surface, like someone who saw stories where others saw scenery. Before Naomi could ask what brought him to Harbor Light, Madison called from ahead. "Naomi, come on!" Julian stepped aside, but his eyes lingered for a moment longer than necessary. "Enjoy the festival," he said. As Naomi hurried to catch up, she glanced back once. Julian was still standing there, watching the fog gather low over the water. Near the midpoint of the stone causeway stood Noah, the paper boy, bundled in an oversized dark coat and faded red scarf, his small figure almost blending into the gray evening. At 13, he still had the lean awkwardness of adolescence, but there was always something unsettlingly composed about him, as if sorrow had aged him faster than time. He held something out in his gloved palm, a silver coin, old and darkened with tarnish. "For you," he said quietly. Naomi frowned. "Why?" His gray-brown eyes lifted to hers, sad in a way no child's eyes should be. "If you come back after the fog settles, keep this in your hand." Naomi stared at the coin. It was cold against her skin. Before she could ask anything else, Madison's voice came sharper this time. "Naomi!" Flustered, Naomi slipped the coin into her coat pocket without another thought. As they continued across the causeway, the air grew colder. The sea moved slower here, darker somehow. Ahead, Harbor Light Island glowed with strings of amber lanterns swaying between poles and tents. But halfway across, Naomi distinctly heard Madison lean toward Chloe and whisper something too low to catch. When Naomi turned, Madison only smiled. "Just saying tonight's going to be unforgettable." The words should have sounded harmless. Instead, they landed in Naomi's chest with a strange heaviness. Behind them, Noah remained motionless on the causeway, watching her go with an expression full of quiet sorrow, as though he were witnessing someone step into the first page of a story he already knew the ending to. The island rose before them, warm with music, lights, and distant laughter. Naomi stepped onto Harbor Light's wooden dock entrance, the glow of festival lanterns reflecting in her glasses. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that hidden inside Madison's coat pocket was a small object wrapped in blue cloth, something old Blackwater families still carried on fog nights. A gift. An offering. A way to pay the sea for safe return, and Madison had made sure Naomi carried nothing at all. By the time Naomi Carter stepped fully onto Harbor Light Island, the last blue light of evening had dissolved into a deep autumn gold. The island looked nothing like the quiet, weather-beaten place people saw during the day. Tonight it had transformed into something cinematic, almost dreamlike. Strings of warm yellow lanterns stretched between old sail masts planted around the square, swaying gently in the ocean wind. The smell of apple pies, buttered lobster rolls, hot clam chowder, and cinnamon cider drifted through the cold air, wrapping around the crowd like comfort. A country band played near the old lighthouse steps, fiddle and guitar blending with the crash of distant waves, while laughter rose and fell across the festival grounds like another layer of music. For a moment, Naomi forgot every warning. She stood there in her navy coat, short hair brushed by the wind, her round glasses reflecting the lantern glow, and her small leather notebook tucked safely inside her satchel. The warmth of the scene softened the tension she had carried from the causeway. People greeted her almost immediately. "Naomi, you made it!" "Naomi, come see the carving booth." "Naomi, your parents' chowder recipe won first place again." This was the strange magic she carried everywhere in Blackwater Bay. It was never loud, never forced. Her intelligence, kindness, and the calm warmth in her voice made people feel instantly at ease. Even here, among tourists from nearby towns and old harbor families dressed for the autumn celebration, Naomi became a quiet center of gravity. Madison noticed it first. Standing beside the mulled cider stall in her elegant cream coat, she watched as people instinctively turned toward Naomi. Madison had spent half the afternoon choosing the perfect outfit, expecting the island lights to make her the most noticeable girl there. Instead, once again, Naomi was the one people remembered. Chloe's nervous smile tightened. Sierra folded her arms and looked away, pretending not to care. But Madison's jealousy was becoming sharper now. less like irritation and more like hunger. Naomi wandered toward the lighthouse square, where the festival opened into a broad stone plaza overlooking the dark water. That was when she saw him again. Julian Whitmore. Tonight, he looked even more striking beneath the lanterns than he had on the causeway. Tall, broad-shouldered, and effortlessly polished in a charcoal peacoat and dark scarf, Julian carried the kind of confidence that came from education and old family legacy rather than arrogance. His dark hair caught the wind, and his gray eyes held the same observant intelligence Naomi had noticed earlier. But what made him interesting wasn't his appearance. It was the way he listened. "Naomi Carter," he said with a faint smile. "I was hoping I'd see you here." Naomi laughed softly. "Do you always say that to girls whose papers you save from flying into the sea? Only the ones carrying notebooks full of local legends." That made her pause. "You notice that?" Julian's smile deepened. "I notice people who pay attention." The line should have sounded flirtatious, but instead it landed with unexpected sincerity. They moved toward the edge of the square, where the old lighthouse loomed behind them, its brick tower lit by strings of amber bulbs wrapped around the lower railing. The crowd's music and chatter became softer here, replaced by the hush of waves below the cliff. Julian reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a weathered postcard. "This belongs with your notebook." Naomi took it carefully. It was a faded postcard of Blackwater Lighthouse in 1978, the tower standing alone beneath thick white fog. On the back was a handwritten note she couldn't fully read in the dim light. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "My grandfather kept a box of old harbor records," Julian said. "Maps, letters, postcards, things tied to the disappearances." Naomi looked up sharply. "The disappearances?" Julian nodded, his voice dropping lower. "I've been researching the missing person cases around Blackwater Bay. Some of them never made it into official reports." The wind seemed colder all of a sudden. "Why?" He hesitated, and for the first time a shadow crossed his face. "Because someone in my family vanished in the fog 30 years ago." Naomi stared at him. This was no longer casual festival conversation. "There was a woman," Julian continued, eyes drifting toward the black water below. "Her name kept surfacing in old papers, but the details were always missing. My family buried the story. I want to know why." Naomi's fingers tightened around the postcard. The missing woman in the article Noah had left. The old photo in the bookstore. The map. The note. "She waits here." For the first time, Julian didn't feel like just a handsome stranger. He felt connected to the same mystery that had been quietly circling Naomi's life, and that made him impossible to ignore. Back in the square, Madison had been watching them for nearly 10 minutes. Each laugh between Naomi and Julian felt like a match striking inside her. When a gray-haired local elder named Mr. Walter Briggs, a thin, stooped man in his 70s known for remembering every storm Blackwater Bay had survived, paused near the chowder booth and muttered to another guest, Madison caught the words clearly. 30 years to the night." She turned sharply. "What did you say?" Walter barely looked at her. "The cycle. Same fog, same tide, same date." Then he moved on, leaving the words hanging like frost in the air. Madison's heart raced. She didn't fully understand what he meant, but it made tonight feel larger, stranger, and more dangerous than even she had planned. Later, Naomi drifted toward a small vintage photography tent, where festival volunteers had displayed restored images from the town's history. Old fishing crews, harbor weddings, storm wreckage, lighthouse keepers. Then one photograph stopped her. It was a sepia image of a young woman standing beside the seawall decades earlier. The resemblance hit Naomi so suddenly, she almost dropped the postcard. The woman had the same small face shape, the same intelligent eyes, even the same stillness in the way she stood. The only difference was the clothing. 1970s wool coat, long curled hair, and no glasses. "Who is she?" Naomi whispered. Before anyone could answer, movement near the lighthouse cliff caught her eye. A tall, gaunt silhouette in a dark wool coat stood far below the main staircase. Mr. Elias Boone. Even from this distance, Naomi recognized the severe outline of the former lighthouse keeper, shoulders slightly bowed by age, but presence still unmistakably heavy. "Mr. Boone," she called. The figure turned. For 1 second she was sure he looked directly at her. Then a passing sweep of fog moved across the cliffside, and when it cleared, he was gone. Naomi frowned, unsettled. The festival carried on around her, brighter and louder now as the night deepened. Then, just after 10, she froze. Her parents were standing near the cider booth. Daniel Carter's expression was harder than she had ever seen it, his tall frame rigid with restrained anger. Ruth stood beside him in her dark coat, disappointment written more painfully across her face than rage ever could. "Naomi!" Her father's voice cut through the music. The joy drained out of the night in an instant. "I'm sorry," Naomi said immediately, stepping toward them. "I know I promised." "You did," Daniel said. Ruth's eyes softened, but only with hurt. "We trusted you." The words stung far worse than yelling. Naomi lowered her head, ashamed. "I'll go back right now." Daniel nodded once. "Good." Behind them, Madison, Chloe, and Sierra stood in the lantern light, pretending concern. But hidden inside their coat pockets were small blue cloth bundles, each containing the old sea offerings Blackwater families still carried on fog-heavy nights. Bits of sail rope, silver charms, dried herbs. Naomi saw none of it. Her thoughts were too tangled in guilt. Worse, when she reached for her coat pocket out of habit, she felt only empty fabric. Her coat. She had left it earlier in the changing room beside the photography tent when the crowd grew warm. The silver coin Noah gave her was still inside. Forgotten. By the time she hurried to retrieve it, the tent had already been packed away and locked for the night. The coat was nowhere in sight. A cold wave of unease moved through her, but Madison was already calling from the path. "Naomi, we need to leave before the tide shifts." The music behind them faded as the four girls made their way toward the dark causeway leading back to Blackwater Bay. Lantern light gave way to moonlight. The wind sharpened. Halfway down the first stone steps toward the sea path, Naomi slipped her hand into her pocket one more time, hoping somehow the coin had been there all along. Nothing. Her stomach tightened. For the first time that night, fear pressed fully into her chest, because now she understood. The silver coin Noah had insisted she keep. The strange sadness in his eyes. The way Madison kept glancing at Chloe. Naomi stopped walking. Her breath caught in the cold air. Her pocket was empty. The silver coin was gone. The path back to Blackwater Bay no longer looked like the same causeway Naomi had crossed only hours earlier. The autumn festival lights behind them faded into distant gold, swallowed one strand at a time by the growing white fog rolling off the Atlantic. Ahead, the stone causeway stretched across the black water in a narrow, uneven line, slick with tide spray and silvered by moonlight. The cold had sharpened too, biting through coats and gloves, and the sea itself seemed to breathe slower, darker, as if something beneath it had begun to wake. Naomi walked a half-step behind Madison, Chloe, and Sierra, her heartbeat louder than the wind. The empty feeling in her pocket wouldn't leave her. The silver coin Noah had pressed into her hand, "If you come back after the fog settles, keep this in your hand," was gone. She replayed every moment in her head. The photography tent, the coat rack, her parents' disappointed faces, Madison calling her to hurry. Somewhere in that rush, the one object that now felt vitally important had been left behind. The further they moved onto the causeway, the quieter everything became. The festival music vanished first, then the sound of gulls, then even the waves against the rocks below seemed to dull into silence. Naomi slowed. "Do you hear that?" Chloe glanced over her shoulder too quickly. "Hear what?" "The ocean." No one answered. Madison kept walking until they reached the midpoint of the stone path. the darkest stretch where the water ran deepest on both sides and the old harbor lamps no longer reached. Then she stopped. So did Sierra. A beat later, Chloe froze beside them, visibly tense. Naomi frowned. "Why are we stopping?" Madison turned slowly, the lantern light from the island now too far behind to soften her face. In the pale moonglow, her features looked sharper, colder. For the first time that night, the friendliness she had worn like a costume was gone. Without a word, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in blue cloth. Sierra did the same. Then Chloe, her fingers trembling. Naomi stared. Each bundle was tied with thin white string and no larger than the palm of a hand. Madison bent down and tossed hers into the dark water. It disappeared without a splash. Sierra followed. Then Chloe. The sea swallowed all three offerings in silence. Naomi's stomach dropped. "What are you doing?" Madison looked at her, and this time her smile held no warmth at all. "It's what everyone from here knows to bring." The words hit Naomi harder than the wind. Her eyes widened behind her glasses as the truth rearranged itself in an instant. The warnings, the coin, the sadness in Noah's eyes, the old stories about the fog. "You knew," Naomi whispered. Madison tilted her head, almost amused. "Of course we knew." Sierra crossed her arms. "Our families have done this for years." Naomi took a shaky step forward. "Then why didn't you tell me?" Chloe looked away first, guilt flickering across her face. But Madison answered. "Because for once," she said softly, "we wanted the night to be about someone else." The jealousy beneath the words was no longer hidden. It was raw now, sharp, personal. Naomi felt the cold deepen in her chest. Every glance Madison had thrown her, every smile Chloe forced, every tight silence from Sierra, it all snapped into focus. "You planned this," Naomi said. Madison's expression barely changed. Naomi's voice trembled. "Please, just give me one, anything." She reached toward Chloe first. Chloe flinched backward. "Please," Naomi said, desperation rising now. "A ribbon, a string, anything from the cloth." For one brief second, Chloe's eyes filled with hesitation, but Madison stepped between them. "No." Sierra's jaw tightened, though something uncertain passed through her face. Madison's voice dropped colder still. "A smart girl like you should have known better." Naomi looked between them, panic fully blooming now. The fog around them thickened so quickly it felt unnatural, swallowing the far ends of the causeway until only the wet stones beneath their feet remained visible. "Don't do this," Naomi pleaded. But Madison had already turned away. "Come on." Sierra followed first, faster than before. Chloe lingered half a second longer, looking back at Naomi with visible fear, then hurried after the others. Naomi was left standing alone in the center of the causeway. The fog surged inward, and then the sound of the sea disappeared completely. No wind, no tide, no gulls, nothing. Only silence. A silence so complete it pressed against her ears. Naomi's breathing became the only sound left in the world. Then something moved inside the white. At first it was only a shape. Tall. Still. Slowly emerging. The figure stepped forward through the fog with impossible calm, as though the mist itself were making room for her. She was a woman, or had once been. She wore a long, sea-soaked dress, the fabric clinging to her in pale layers of gray and green, stitched with the faded elegance of another era. Her hair hung in wet, black strands far past her shoulders, moving as though underwater, even in still air. Her face was heartbreakingly beautiful, but hollowed by sorrow. Skin pale as moonlit surf, lips colorless, and eyes, those eyes, deep, mournful, and cold as the Atlantic in November. This was no rumor, no town legend. This was the fog keeper. Naomi could not move. The woman's gaze settled on her with an expression Naomi could not fully understand. There was anger there, but beneath it, something worse. Pain. recognition, as if she had been waiting for Naomi specifically. For years. For decades. Naomi's voice cracked. "I didn't know." The fog keeper tilted her head. Her wet hair shifted across her shoulders like drifting kelp. The silence around them deepened. Naomi forced herself to keep speaking. "They knew. They didn't tell me. Please, I would have brought something if I had known." For the briefest instant, the woman's expression changed. Not softer, but sadder. Then the fog around Naomi's feet began to move. Not drift. Move. It spiraled upward in twisting ribbons, circling her ankles, cold as seawater and tightening with impossible strength. Naomi gasped and stumbled backward. "No!" She reached instinctively for the stone railing edge, but the wet causeway betrayed her. Her foot slipped. She crashed hard onto the slick stone. Her round glasses flew from her face, skidding across the wet path and coming to rest near the edge of the rock. The fog wrapped tighter. Naomi clawed at the stones, fingers scraping salt and moss. The fog keeper stood motionless, watching with the same terrible mixture of grief and judgment. Then the mist pulled. Hard. Naomi screamed as the white spiral dragged her backward off the edge of the causeway. The last thing she saw was the moon above the fog. Then everything vanished into white. On the mainland side of the harbor, a distant figure stood near the darkened dock. Julian Whitmore. He had stayed behind after the festival, unable to shake the unease that had settled over him the moment Naomi left. Tall, in his dark coat, hands shoved deep into his pockets against the cold, he stared toward the causeway as the fog swallowed its center. Then he saw it, a shape, a moving silhouette between the white walls of mist. For one breathless second, he thought it might be Naomi, but the figure vanished too quickly to be certain. His pulse spiked. Behind the rocks, closer to shore, Noah crouched low, his small frame almost hidden by shadow and seagrass. The 13-year-old's gray-brown eyes followed the mist with a grief far too old for his face. At his feet lay Naomi's forgotten wool scarf, caught on a jagged piece of stone near the causeway entrance. He picked it up carefully, brushing the salt spray from its fabric. Then the lighthouse horn sounded, once, twice, 3 times. 3. The same number Naomi had read in the old newspaper article about the disappearance 30 years earlier. Far out on the stone path where Naomi had vanished, something new remained. A mark. A white salt imprint shaped unmistakably like a human hand, pressed into the wet rock as if the sea itself had touched the causeway and left a warning behind. By the time Madison, Chloe, and Sierra reached the mainland, their breathing was ragged and their faces drained of color. For 1 second, Chloe turned as if she might run back. Madison grabbed her arm. No one saw anything. Sierra swallowed hard. What if someone did? Madison's eyes flashed. Then we say she stayed behind. No one spoke after that. They walked away fast, each silently trying to convince herself that the fog had taken the problem with it. The next morning dawned colder than the last. The fog had thinned into pale streaks over the water. Daniel Carter stood on the causeway, boots wet with tide spray, his face carved with dread. Something glinted ahead halfway across the stones. He moved faster, then stopped. There, resting perfectly still in the center of the wet causeway, lay Naomi's glasses. Unbroken. Cold. Their lenses filmed with fine salt mist. Daniel bent slowly, hands trembling as he picked them up. The metal frame was freezing against his fingers, and for the first time in his life, the sea below Blackwater Bay no longer felt like home. It felt like it was keeping something. By sunrise, Blackwater Bay no longer felt like a town. It felt like a wound. The harbor, usually alive with diesel engines, gull cries, and the clang of rigging against masts, moved beneath a strange hush. Even the fishermen spoke in lowered voices as if the sea itself were listening. Salt mist clung to the streets, to porch rails, to the Carter family's restaurant windows, and every whispered conversation in town led to the same name, Naomi Carter, missing, The news spread faster than the morning fog. By 8 o'clock, handwritten flyers were already taped to telephone poles, shop windows, and the wooden notice board beside the marina. Naomi's photograph, short hair, round glasses, thoughtful dark eyes, looked out over the town she had never truly left until last night. Daniel Carter barely remembered walking home from the causeway. His hands still shook from the cold metal of Naomi's glasses resting in his coat pocket. The frames were now wrapped in one of Ruth's kitchen towels and carried like something sacred, something too fragile to expose to daylight. Ruth stood beside him on Harbor Street, pale from a sleepless night but refusing to break. Her pain had sharpened into motion. She spoke to neighbors, called the sheriff's office, organized volunteers, and searched every place Naomi had ever loved. The bookstore, the harbor benches, the cliffside overlook where she used to write. What frightened Daniel most was how quietly his wife was hurting. Meanwhile, the entire town seemed to pour into the search. The harbor master loaned boats. Store owners brought coffee and blankets. Even tourists staying in the coastal inn joined the shoreline sweep. And among them, moving with practiced concern, were Madison, Chloe, and Sierra. Madison Reed looked exhausted in a way that would have seemed convincing to anyone who hadn't watched her too carefully. Her blonde hair was tied back in a loose knot, dark circles shadowing her eyes, and she spoke in the soft, urgent tone people used when they wanted to sound useful. "We'll cover the South Pier," she told the volunteer group. Chloe, pale and visibly shaken, helped tape missing posters onto lamp posts, her fingers trembling each time she pressed Naomi's picture flat. Sierra Hall, taller and stronger than the others, carried stacks of flyers and handed them out at the marina. But every time Daniel passed by, she looked away too fast. They played their roles well, but the performance was starting to crack. Every time they saw Ruth's face, every time Daniel called Naomi's name into the fog, every time someone asked, "When did you last see her?" The memory of Naomi being pulled backward into the white kept replaying in all three of their minds. By late morning, Daniel left the shoreline search and climbed the northern bluff path toward the old keeper's cottage. The wind was colder here. The abandoned North Breakwater lighthouse stood ahead, dark and weather-worn against the pale sky, its glass lantern room clouded by years of salt and neglect. At the cottage porch sat Mr. Elias Boone, wrapped in a heavy charcoal peacoat, his long, gaunt frame bent slightly with age. At 79, Elias still carried the severe dignity of the man he had once been, the keeper who had kept the town's light alive through storms, blackouts, and shipwreck winters. Deep lines cut through his weathered face, and his silver hair, once thick, now lay windblown against his temples. He looked up the moment Daniel approached. Then his eyes fell to the towel-wrapped object in Daniel's hands. Without a word, Daniel unfolded the cloth. Naomi's glasses caught the gray daylight. Elias went still, color drained from his already pale face. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Then he whispered, almost to himself, 30 years. Daniel's chest tightened. "You know what happened to her." It wasn't a question. Elias looked toward the dark causeway below. "There was another girl once." His voice had changed, rougher now, pulled from somewhere buried deep. Her name was Maren Whitlock. The name settled into the cold air like an old curse. Elias motioned Daniel inside. The cottage smelled of cedar smoke, rusted metal, and old sea journals. Every shelf was lined with notebooks, tide logs, and photographs of storms past. On the mantel above the cold fireplace sat a faded framed image of a young woman with long dark hair, a small face, and eyes filled with intelligence and quiet sadness. Daniel froze. She looked hauntingly similar to Naomi. Elias followed his gaze. That was Maren. He sat heavily by the window, eyes on the fog beyond the glass. She was the woman I loved. Elias told the story slowly, each word carrying the weight of decades. 30 years earlier, Maren Whitlock had been the brightest young woman in Blackwater Bay, beautiful, educated, and determined to leave the town's old money politics behind. but her family had arranged for her to marry Charles Whitmore, heir to the wealthiest shipping family in the region, a man she did not love. On the night she tried to run, she crossed the causeway in thick fog. She carried no offering, no promise, no token for safe return. The town said she drowned. But Elias had stood in the lighthouse window and seen the fog move against the tide. He had seen a woman-shaped silhouette rise from it, and he had spent 30 years knowing Marin had never truly died. She was taken, Elias said, voice breaking at last. Held in the place between sea and memory. Daniel stared at him. The fog keeper. Elias nodded once, nodded. She became what the town feared, because she was first what the town betrayed. Outside the cottage, the wind rattled the porch rails. Back in town, Julian Whitmore sat alone in the Blackwater Historical Society archives, a converted brick building near the courthouse. Tall and composed even in exhaustion, Julian's gray eyes moved quickly over property ledgers, estate records, and private family correspondence dating back decades. Then he found it. A sealed land transfer signed by Charles Whitmore. The date matched Marin's disappearance. The transfer granted Whitmore exclusive rights to the North Lighthouse Bluff and surrounding access paths. Attached was a private letter from Charles's father. No inquiry will continue. The town cannot afford scandal. Julian's pulse quickened. His own family had not merely ignored the truth, they had buried it, and perhaps built their fortune on the silence that followed. Across town, Ruth Carter sat in the bookstore office with Mrs. Evelyn. The older woman looked older than ever today, silver hair loose around her shoulders, blue eyes heavy with guilt. "There's something I should have told you sooner," Evelyn admitted softly. Ruth looked up. For weeks, Naomi kept saying she felt someone calling her name from the sea. The room seemed to tilt. She thought it was just the wind at first, Evelyn continued, fingers twisting in her lap. But she said it happened most near the North Breakwater. Ruth's face went still, as if the story had begun long before last night. Elsewhere, near the Marina warehouse, Sierra finally broke. "I can't do this anymore," she hissed, pacing in front of Madison and Chloe. Her usually sharp voice shook with panic. "She's missing, Madison! What if she's dead?" Madison grabbed her wrist. "She is not dead." The certainty in her tone chilled Chloe. Madison leaned closer, eyes hard. "And if you say anything, we all go down together." Sierra's breathing turned shallow. Fear had finally overtaken jealousy. By evening, Daniel and Ruth returned to the lighthouse cottage, both visibly close to collapse. That was when Noah appeared. The 13-year-old stood in the deepening dusk with his red scarf pulled high against the wind, slim shoulders hunched beneath his oversized coat. Yet his expression was strangely calm, almost solemn. In his hand was an old brass compass, its glass scratched and its casing green with age. He placed it into Daniel's palm. The needle did not point north. It pointed toward the sea. "It doesn't show direction," Noah said quietly. "It shows where memory is strongest." Daniel looked up sharply. Noah's gaze shifted toward the lighthouse cliff. "Wait until midnight beneath the old tower." The fog had already begun thickening again. Ruth stepped forward. "You know where our daughter is." Noah's eyes softened with something like sorrow. "Yes." Midnight came with the old lighthouse looming above them like a grave marker against the white. The air was so still that every breath seemed too loud. Noah stood at the foot of the abandoned tower, his small silhouette framed by fog and moonlight. Then he turned to face Daniel and Ruth. "If you want to see Naomi," he said, voice barely above the sea hush, "follow me." He paused. His expression changed. Older somehow, burdened. "But when you see the woman in the fog," the wind shifted around them. "Don't call her a monster." Midnight wrapped the abandoned lighthouse in a silence so complete it felt sacred. The tower of North Breakwater Lighthouse rose above the cliffs like a dark witness, its weather-beaten bricks silvered by moonlight and half hidden behind sheets of moving white fog. The sea below was invisible now. reduced to a distant hush beneath the cliff, as if the Atlantic itself had stepped back to watch what was about to happen. Daniel and Ruth Carter stood at the foot of the tower, shoulders nearly touching, both exhausted beyond sleep yet held upright by the same fragile force, the certainty that Naomi was still somewhere within reach. In front of them stood Noah, slight and motionless in his oversized dark coat and faded red scarf. The strangest thing was how untouched he seemed by the night. The fog soaked Daniel's jacket and beat it against Ruth's hair, but Noah's coat remained dry, his scarf unmoving, even when the wind shifted. He stood inside the mist like a figure made from it, more shadow than boy. Without another word, Noah led them around the back of the lighthouse where the cliff dropped steeply toward the sea. There, where only jagged stone had stood during daylight, a rotting wooden bridge now stretched outward into the fog. Its planks were narrow, dark with age and slick with salt, bound together by rusted iron nails that should have collapsed years ago, yet the bridge stood solid enough beneath the white haze, as if it only existed when the fog was thick enough to remember it. Ruth's breath caught. This wasn't here before. It only appears when the water and memory are closest, Noah said quietly. Daniel looked down at the compass Noah had given him. The needle trembled violently, then locked toward the bridge. They followed. Each step across the wood sounded too loud in the stillness. The boards groaned beneath Daniel's heavy boots, while Ruth's careful footsteps remained almost soundless. The fog pressed close on both sides, erasing everything beyond the narrow bridge so completely it felt as though they were walking suspended inside a blank world. At the far end, the bridge opened onto a pool of perfectly still water, round and black as polished glass. No ripple touched its surface. It reflected not the night sky, but only the faint ghost of the lighthouse beam far above, a trembling white thread through the fog. And there, on the opposite side of the pool, stood Naomi. Daniel's breath broke into a sound that was half gasp, half prayer. She was alive. Her navy coat was damp with mist, her short hair clinging softly around her small face, and without her round glasses her thoughtful eyes looked larger, more vulnerable. But what struck them hardest was not her appearance, it was her expression. Naomi looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, as if she had spent not hours but years listening to something heavy and endless. Yet the moment she saw her parents, her face cracked with emotion. "Mom, Dad." Ruth nearly ran forward, but Noah raised a hand. The water between them shifted. From the center of the mirror-still pool, the fog keeper rose. Marin's sea-worn dress drifted around her like drowned silk, pale gray and green beneath the white haze. Her wet black hair hung long against her shoulders, and her face, beautiful, hollow, devastatingly sad, held none of the cruelty Daniel had imagined. Instead, there was a grief so old it had hardened into ritual. She crossed the bay without offering respect, the fog keeper said, her voice soft and echoing, as though spoken through layers of water and memory. "The law of this harbor is older than your town and stronger than your fear." Daniel stepped forward. She didn't know. Marin's eyes moved to him. Ignorance does not unbreak a promise. Naomi lowered her gaze. In the strange time she had spent inside the fog, Marin had never harmed her. There had been no chains, no violence, no prison in the ordinary sense. Instead, the fog keeper had led her through fragments of memory, voices of abandoned lovers, fathers who never returned from storms, women promised futures they were denied, brothers forgotten by bloodlines, and one young woman forced toward a marriage she never chose. Naomi had listened to every story, every broken promise, every betrayal swallowed by sea and silence. She understood now that this place between water and memory was not built on cruelty. It was built on wounds that had never been allowed to heal. Ruth stepped closer to the pool's edge, tears already in her eyes. "Please, she is our daughter." The fog keeper watched her for a long moment. Then she spoke. "There is one way." The water beneath the bridge darkened. "You will walk across the drowned path beneath this fog," she said. You will keep your hands joined. You will not take your eyes off the lighthouse light. No matter what voices call you back, you must not turn. Daniel's jaw tightened. And if we do? Marin's expression didn't change. You lose her forever. The bridge dissolved behind them. In its place, a narrow stretch of submerged stone walkway appeared beneath a shallow layer of black seawater. The lighthouse light above remained dark, only its dead glass lens faintly visible through the mist. Daniel took Ruth's hand. He squeezed once. Then they stepped forward into the freezing water. It rose immediately past their ankles, then calves, the submerged stones uneven and slick beneath them. The fog closed tighter, muting distance, making the path ahead impossible to judge. Then the voices began. At first it was Naomi, a child's voice. "Daddy!" Daniel's heart stopped. He heard the sound exactly as it had once echoed through their old apartment when Naomi was 5 and frightened by thunder. Small, trembling, trusting. "Don't leave me." Ruth's fingers tightened around his. "Keep going," she whispered. A moment later, Ruth froze. From somewhere behind them came the sound of a newborn cry. Thin, broken. The child she had lost before Naomi was born. The grief she had buried for over 20 years surged upward with brutal force. "Ruth." Daniel's voice steadied her. "Don't turn." The cries continued, softer now, like something fading into tide. They kept walking. Then Daniel heard another voice. A deep, familiar voice worn smooth by age and storms. His father, dead for 15 years. "Son, come back." Daniel nearly stumbled. His father had taught him to fish, to cook, to trust the sea. Losing him had carved a silence into Daniel he had never fully escaped. "Daniel!" Ruth's voice broke through the fog. "Look at the light." But there was no light, only the dead tower above them. Their legs trembled. The water rose to Ruth's knees, the cold cutting deeper. Then, suddenly, a white beam exploded through the fog. The old lighthouse lantern roared to life above them, slicing a clear silver road across the drowned stones. The safe path. The water ahead glimmered. High above, inside the lantern room, a tall silhouette moved behind the spinning light. Julian Whitmore. He had climbed the abandoned tower alone, using old maintenance ladders and rusted breaker panels. His charcoal coat was gone, sleeves rolled, hands blackened with grease and rust where he had forced the ancient electrical relay system back to life. The beam held steady, and Daniel understood. Julian had chosen to help fix what his bloodline once destroyed. Far below, Naomi saw the light and tears filled her eyes. Julian's voice echoed faintly from the tower window, carried by the beam itself. "Naomi!" She looked up. His next words reached her across fog and water. "My family started this. Charles Whitmore forced Marin into that marriage. He buried the truth after she vanished." Naomi's breath caught. Julian's face, barely visible in the light, held no defense, only honesty. "I won't let them bury it again." The beam stayed fixed. Daniel and Ruth crossed the final stones and reached Naomi. The moment Ruth pulled her daughter into her arms, the fog shifted. The fog keeper stood still, watching the reunion with something dangerously close to sorrow. Then she stepped back. "She is free." Behind a broken section of cliff railing, Chloe Bennett emerged from shadow, shaking so hard she could barely stand. Pale, slim, and usually too hesitant to challenge Madison, she had secretly followed the others' trail to the lighthouse, driven by guilt stronger than fear. She had heard everything. The truth. Marin. The betrayal. And for the first time, the full horror of what they had done shattered whatever loyalty she still felt. Everyone's breath slowed. The worst, it seemed, was over. Then another figure stepped from the fog, Elias Boone. The old lighthouse keeper moved with more certainty than his age should have allowed, coat billowing in the sea wind, silver hair lit by Julian's beam. He crossed the stones, then slowly lowered himself to one knee before the fog keeper. His voice trembled, but only with love. "Marin!" The name struck through the silence like a bell. Daniel, Ruth, Naomi, even Julian above in the tower, all of them went still. The fog keeper's face changed, not monstrous, not spectral, human, painfully human, as if the name itself had reached the woman beneath the legend. For one suspended moment, everyone believed the night had finally ended. Then Noah stepped fully into the lighthouse beam. The dry scarf around his neck stirred for the first time. His young face looked unbearably calm. He lifted his eyes to Marin, and in a voice softer than the tide, he said, "Sister Marin, it's time you let me go." For one suspended moment beneath the revived lighthouse beam, no one moved. The fog that had haunted Blackwater Bay for 30 years drifted in slow white ribbons around the cliffs, the still black water below reflecting the silver light in trembling lines. Naomi stood between her parents, exhausted but safe, her small face pale with everything she had seen and heard in the place between sea and memory. Julian remained high in the lantern room, one hand braced against the old iron frame, his silhouette sharp against the rotating light. Elias Boone knelt before the woman he had loved for 3 decades. And in the center of it all stood Noah, the quiet paper boy whose sadness had always seemed too old for his 13-year-old face. Now everyone finally understood why. Noah stepped fully into the beam, and for the first time the illusion of ordinary childhood began to fade. His slight frame seemed to glow at the edges, the red scarf around his neck lifting in a wind no one else could feel. The boy's gray-brown eyes softened as he looked at Marin, not with fear, not with distance, but with the unbearable tenderness of family. "I was never only Noah," he said quietly. His voice had changed. It still carried the gentleness of the boy Naomi knew, but beneath it was something older, steadier, shaped by decades of waiting. "My name was Thomas Whitlock." The words landed like a final key turning in an ancient lock. Marin's face broke. For the first time since Naomi had seen her rise from the fog, the spectral stillness shattered, revealing the woman buried beneath the legend. Her lips trembled. Her wet, dark hair clung to her pale cheeks as tears finally formed in eyes that had held only grief and judgment for 30 years. "My little brother," she whispered. Thomas nodded. He told them everything. 30 years earlier, when Marin fled the forced marriage arranged by the Whitmore family, Thomas had followed her into the storm. Only 16 then, thin and brave in the reckless way younger brothers often are, he had run into the fog trying to bring her back before the sea took her. But the same curse that claimed Marin caught him too. He died in the crossing. Not fully taken by the sea, not fully released by death. Instead, his spirit had remained trapped between worlds, able to return only in fragments, only in forms memory would allow. A paperboy, a quiet witness, a guide no one questioned. For 30 years he had waited for the conditions to align. The cycle, the fog, the lighthouse, the right heart. Naomi. Thomas looked at her, and Naomi's throat tightened as every strange moment suddenly made sense. "The silver coin," she whispered. He smiled sadly, "So you would have a choice." "The scarf? So your father would know where the sea began to remember." "The compass? To lead them where the path between worlds opened." He turned toward Julian above the light. "And the tower relay? I left enough memory in the old keeper's logs for him to find the wiring." Julian's expression tightened with emotion. Every step had been guided. Every clue had been mercy disguised as mystery. Everything had been leading to this night. Marin's tears fell freely now, vanishing into the fog around her. When she looked at Naomi, the cold severity was gone completely. "I never hated you," she said, voice trembling. "I only saw myself in you." Naomi's breath caught. Marin took a slow step closer. A kind girl, curious, intelligent, believing that smiling faces meant safe hearts. The truth of it cut through Naomi more deeply than the cold ever had. Marin had not kept her out of vengeance. She had kept her because Naomi mirrored the young woman Marin had once been, the version of herself that still believed. Promises meant protection. Naomi stepped forward despite Daniel's protective instinct to stop her. Her voice was gentle. Then let it end here. At that moment, the horizon beyond the cliffs began to pale. Dawn. The first soft line of morning touched the water. Julian descended from the lighthouse and crossed the stone path toward them, his charcoal coat draped over one arm, his hands still streaked with grease from the old electrical panel. Tall, composed, but visibly changed by what he had learned, he stopped before Marin. His gray eyes held no trace of inherited pride now, only responsibility. "My family owes you more than apology," he said, voice carrying clearly across the cliffside. By then, townspeople had begun gathering near the base path. Search volunteers, harbor workers, Mrs. Evelyn, the sheriff, and others, drawn by the lighthouse beam roaring back to life after decades of darkness. Julian turned so they could all hear him. "Charles Whitmore forced Marin into the marriage that destroyed her life. My family covered up what happened after she disappeared. We buried the records, bought silence, and built our reputation on that lie." A wave of shocked murmurs moved through the crowd. Madison, Chloe, and Sierra stood near the rear, faces drained of all color. Julian's voice strengthened. "I will reopen every sealed file, restore the lighthouse, fund a full historical inquiry, and Marin Whitlock's name will be cleared publicly." The old lie finally had a witness strong enough to destroy it. Beside him, Elias Boone rose slowly from one knee. Tall, even in age, his gaunt frame seemed steadier than it had in years. He stepped toward Marin, eyes full of the kind of love that survives not because it is easy, but because it refuses to die. He reached out his hand. Marin looked at it. Then, trembling, she took it. The moment their fingers touched, the fog changed. The white veil surrounding the cliffs brightened into gold as the first full rays of dawn spilled over Blackwater Bay. The sea below shimmered like molten glass. The spectral edges of Marin's dress began to dissolve, not into darkness, but into warmth. For one brief, miraculous moment, the curse released her. The woman standing before them was no longer the fog keeper. She was simply Marin Whitlock, alive in form, human in every detail. The long dark hair no longer soaked. The pale sadness in her face softened into peace. The intelligence and grace Naomi had recognized in the old photographs now fully restored. Mrs. Evelyn, watching from the crowd, whispered through tears, "That's the girl from the photograph." Then she looked at Naomi and finally confessed, "The photo you saw at the festival." It was Marin, years before the fog. Thomas stepped forward, no longer only the paper boy, but the younger brother frozen in the memory of 16, slim, dark-haired, earnest-eyed, still carrying the innocence of the night he died trying to save her. Marin smiled through tears and pulled him into her arms. The embrace lasted only seconds, but it held 30 years of waiting. Then, together, sister and brother turned toward the water. Their forms softened into morning light, and slowly, gently, both spirits dissolved into the sunrise reflected across the bay. The fog was gone. Not thinning, gone. Behind the gathered townspeople, Chloe finally broke completely. Pale, trembling, tears streaking down her face, she confessed everything. The offerings, the causeway, Naomi's pleas. Sierra, already shattered by guilt, joined her, voice cracking as she admitted they had followed Madison's plan out of jealousy and fear. Madison resisted until the end. Tall, rigid, her once perfect confidence splintered by public truth, she denied, deflected, and blamed everyone but herself. But this was no longer a secret town rumor. Too many witnesses, too much truth. One by one, even people from her own family stepped away. No shouting, no violence, only something colder. The complete withdrawal of trust. Within days, Madison, Chloe, and Sierra's families arranged to leave Blackwater Bay. Chloe and Sierra left quietly, burdened but remorseful. Madison left last, still refusing to look back. Naomi returned home. Mrs. Evelyn placed a new pair of round glasses into her hands, silver-rimmed and stronger than the old ones. "For the girl who sees what others miss," she said softly. Back at Carter's Harbor kitchen, Daniel spent evenings repairing an old oak writing desk that had once belonged to Ruth's father. He sanded the wood smooth, polished its surface, and placed it beside the front window overlooking the harbor so Naomi could write with the sea in view. Above the restaurant door, Ruth hung a silver coin on a blue ribbon, a quiet symbol of gratitude, not fear, for the water that had finally returned their daughter. Julian stayed. What began as duty slowly became choice. He helped restore the lighthouse, reopened the Whitmore archives, and quietly donated funds to establish the Marin Whitlock Scholarship, awarded each year to young women in Maine who loved literature, history, and maritime storytelling. Naomi and Julian grew closer in the months that followed, but not through dramatic declarations. It happened in long evenings over archival boxes, shared coffee at the harbor, and silent walks beneath a sky no longer haunted by fog. Respect came first. Trust followed. The deeper feeling between them rose slowly, honestly, like dawn over water. Months later, Blackwater Bay celebrated the relighting of the restored lighthouse. The town square was full again, but this time without shadows. Naomi, wearing her new glasses and carrying the same worn leather notebook that had followed her through every chapter of the mystery, stood on the harbor stage as the town's newly appointed director of the Blackwater Historical Archive. Her first book had just been released. The promises the fog kept. Mrs. Evelyn held up the first printed copy with trembling hands. Julian stood nearby, proud but quiet. Daniel and Ruth watched from the front row, hands clasped together. At the final page of her old notebook, Naomi had written one final line. "The sea does not keep good people. It only keeps the promises others are too afraid to face." As the lighthouse beam swept across the now clear bay, Julian stepped beside her and gently took her hand. The water reflected only sunrise. No fog, no curse, no waiting grief. At last, Blackwater Bay had healed. The lesson at the end of this story is gentle but powerful for everyday life. Sometimes the deepest pain in life does not come from strangers. It comes from broken trust, hidden jealousy, silence, and promises people were too afraid to face. In our daily lives, we may never stand in a fog-covered bay, but many of us walk through emotional fog created by misunderstanding, envy, family wounds, and words left unsaid. Naomi survived not because she was stronger than everyone else, but because truth, family love, accountability, and courage finally stood together. That is the real lesson for us. Small choices matter. The way we treat people matters. A smile can heal, but a false smile can destroy trust for years. Jealousy can quietly ruin lives, while honesty and compassion can rebuild what pain once broke. This story also teaches us something deeply educational about history and responsibility. The mistakes of one generation do not disappear just because people stop talking about them. Healing begins when someone is brave enough to tell the truth, correct the record, and restore dignity to those who were wronged. In everyday life, that may mean apologizing, admitting fault, protecting someone being judged unfairly, or refusing to join gossip and cruelty. So as you leave this story, ask yourself this simple question: what promises in my own life need truth, healing, and courage? If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment telling us what part moved you the most. And if you believe truth always finds its light, comment Amen, so this message of healing can reach more people. Please subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay with us for more stories that change lives. May God bless every person watching right now with peace, wisdom, protection, and the courage to face every storm with faith and love. Amen.